She used to be a politician. Now she's keeping him honest. Danielle Smith on 770 CHQR.
Brought to you by the Popowich Carmeli Advisory Group, CIBC Wood Gundy.
All right. I felt the same way as one of our listeners who said, oh, goody, Peter Zeihan, who is a geopolitical strategist and critically acclaimed author. There's so much I could talk to him about because the last time we spoke about, because he came to Calgary to deliver a speech about the options for Alberta. He had written about the challenges of keeping this country together all the way back in 2014, because principally we have an aging demographic in Eastern Canada, younger demographic in Alberta, and essentially nothing but transfers going from one region to the other, which is fundamentally unstable. So that was his view back in 2014, and he talked about the different options when he came to deliver a speech in Calgary a few months ago. But now, I may get an update on how he looks at the situation now, especially in light of this article that just appeared on the CNN International website. An oil-addicted world is what this part of Canada is banking on. The pandemic could have been a decisive moment in the fight against climate change. Instead, some of the biggest fossil fuel-producing countries are looking at it. Let me just see how the rest of that subtitle ends. I think they changed the title. We're about to waste it, is what he says. But this is the point, right? Is that this is what our energy war room should be fighting. This came out about an hour ago. I'll see how long it takes for the government's war room to respond to this. But now this has been blasted out all over the world that we're the bad guy once again. Meanwhile, there's a major shakeup that's taking place in the Middle East around oil politics. And it was just like, oh, yeah, whatever. So these two things intersect. And I have a fear that if we don't start defending ourselves more aggressively on the international stage, we are not going to see the kind of recovery that I want to see and that the world needs. Now, let's see what Peter Zeihan has to think. He is, once again, is a geopolitical strategist, critically acclaimed author. He's been writing about what's going on in the Middle East, and I thought you'd enjoy his perspective on this. In particular, this stuck out to me as he was talking about the Gulf states. The Gulfies might not like the Americans very much, but the Americans have a vested interest in the Gulf states remaining independent and making boatloads of money by selling their hydrocarbons. For the locals, it was a sweet deal. Any post-American power that comes to the Gulf is unlikely to be nearly as, how shall we say it, understanding. So what does this all have to do with the normalization of relations in the deal between the United Arab Emirates and Israel? Simply put, the Emiratis, really, all the Gulfies, know that the Americans are leaving, and they are massively, hysterically unable to look out for their own interests in the world that is coming. Between the threats of Iran, their own populations, and the extra-regional powers, none of them are long for this world. That's a pretty bold prediction, but he's in the business of doing that. Peter Zeihan joins me now to walk us through his thinking on this. Peter, thanks so much for being with me again.
My pleasure. Great to be back.
Yeah, so I don't know, maybe I could start with Alberta, because I'm wondering how we fit in this whole mix. Do you still think that Alberta has kind of three options? Just suck it up and stay in Canada, go independent, or join America, which I think were the three options that you put on the table years ago?
I have personally never thought that independence was a viable option. Being landlocked and being at the mercy of either Ottawa or Washington would not be a comfortable place to be. If you think BC treats you badly now, imagine if you actually broke away. And you have seen how the United States treats its trade partners under the Trump administration recently, and you do not want to be on the receiving end of that. So it's really one or the other, stay Canadian or become American.
All right. So do you have any advice about what you think would be the better option for us? Because it does seem like the Americans are far more interested in maintaining the oil supply in the Middle East than potentially they are on the North American continent.
That is, nobody can make that decision for you. It's obviously big. It is obviously fraught. One of the things that has changed since the coronavirus epidemic is you, for the first time in, I'd say, 15 years, actually have seen Ottawa treat you better. Whether it's better enough, no one can decide that except for you. But the giant sucking sound of the last 15 years has at least quieted down a little bit, and that is worth noting.
Do you think it changes if there's a change in the White House? I don't know how to gauge what Joe Biden is running on. I don't know if we should take him seriously.
It's not just you.
Okay.
It's not just you. Biden is the ultimate political chameleon. He has switched sides on every major issue of the last 40 years so that he could be in line with what he perceived the majority of Democrats wanted to hear, which means he's also been on the wrong side of every issue in the last 40 years, at least once. There's nothing about what he is saying that we can really trust at present, which is kind of like it was for Trump and kind of like it was for Obama, unfortunately.
Okay, so tell us how you're perceiving America's energy independence right now, because I've always felt like Canada should be part and parcel of that, and that we should all be working together, and that they're not as reliant on Middle East oil anymore, and they don't need to have an interest in that area. Or do they kind of still need to be supportive of Middle East oil interests as a bit of a backup in the event that their shale oil doesn't pan out, or we can't get Keystone Pipeline built? How does the Middle East fit into the current national energy strategy of the U.S.?
For the United States, from a national security and an economic and a transport point of view, as well as an environmental point of view, energy self-sufficiency makes a lot of sense. And the shale revolution has gotten us there in net terms. The biggest complication the American industrial complex faces right now is it was designed to run in a lot heavier crude, for example, Albertan crude, than what the shale fields are producing. It's a lot of light and a lot of sweet. So we do today still need to import 5 to 7 million barrels a day of lower quality crude in order to get the specific product mix that our refineries are designed to produce. But with every passing month, the refiners are tweaking their hardware in order to work on lighter and lighter and lighter crude. So if we decided that we wanted to make a hard switch today, the United States, I have no doubt, could do a complete overhaul so that the only heavy crude it was taking was from Alberta and be done within a year and a half. But as long as the global system is allowing this cheaper, lower quality crude to be available and the U.S. can still get it, it makes sense to import that and export some of the light sweet shale, which sells on the international market at a premium. So it's just about the numbers right now, but the numbers are steadily switching towards full independence.
So tell us then what the current mix is. Who are the most, aside from Canada, who is the U.S. most reliant on in the international scene? Because it used to be Saudi Arabia, maybe it still is, but strangely, you've got United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, the first to broker this deal with Israel, with the U.S. encouraging them. So first, tell me how important the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain are to American oil interests.
For the Americans, the short version is not even remotely. We get more of our heavy crude from Canada than everywhere else put together. It used to be that we got a lot of the heavier stuff from Venezuela and Mexico. But Mexico's economic success means they're exporting almost nothing now, and Venezuela has imploded. And those two factors are a big part of why the United States has accelerated this kind of piecemeal transition to lighter, sweeter crude. We still do get stuff from the Gulf, but if you take Iraq and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and Oman and UAE, put them all together, it's still less than what we get from Canada.
Okay, and so who is reliant on the Gulf states then for their energy?
China.
It's all China. What about Europe?
It's mostly China, with Japan in second place.
So China first, Japan in second. And where's Europe getting their supply from?
Europe is primarily sourced from the Russians, with a fair amount that still comes from Norway and the remainder coming from North Africa.
Okay, so tell us again about this historic deal that we had in the past, because that is confusing to me, because I thought that America really was securing the trade routes for our partners in Europe. But as it seems, like, why would we protect the Middle East so that we can secure a cheap supply of energy for China? That's we being North America or the U.S. Why would they do that?
Yeah, this is part of the irony of American policy right now. Americans have decided they're no longer interested in holding up the global ceiling, but they're still kind of going through the motions, and the United States has now emerged as the single largest factor for Chinese success. It's kind of hilarious if you can check your brain a little bit. The reason that this specific deal happened, two things are going on. Number one, the Gulfies in general in the Arab world, the Gulfies in specific in the Arab world in general, have honestly had a pretty good working relationship with Israel for about 20 years now. Once they realized that groups like Al-Qaeda were going to have significant security ramifications, they started backing away from this ideological opposition to Israel, and they started disassociating themselves from the Palestinians. The rise of Iran caused a lot of problems, and they knew that they had to have a competent regional power that didn't want to conquer them, that they could kind of trust. And Israel was the only one. So there's been intelligence and military cooperation exchanges going on between the Gulfies and the Israelis now for over 15 years. And it's gotten to the point that Israeli intelligence is regularly informing the Gulf militaries and vice versa on what's going on throughout the region. It's a relatively friendly relationship. It's just been below the table. They didn't want to break the seal, so to speak, on the diplomatic question. Which brings us to the
how
second
important
question.
is it now that they've broken the seal? Because I'm getting different competing commentators on this. Ones who say, absolutely, this is a big deal. You got the two different legislators who've nominated Donald Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize. I've got others saying, no big deal. These are two small fries. It doesn't really matter in the big scheme of things. Where do you fall on it?
I'm kind of in the middle. I mean, it is a big deal, and these are just the first two countries. Oman will probably be next, and I would expect Kuwait and Saudi Arabia within a year or two. This changes what it means to be Arab. This changes the Arab League. This changes the relationships of the region. And if you can marry Israeli technology with the money out of the Gulf, you can achieve a lot of really interesting things that go in a lot of different directions. It's obviously a big problem for Iran, because can you imagine the Israelis having Air Force basing rights on the eastern side of the Arabian Peninsula? They don't need the United States to bomb the Iranian nuclear program then. They can do it themselves.
Wow.
So this does reset a lot of relationships.
Okay, so let's then talk about, one of the things that you're saying is that this is kind of existential for some of these smaller states. Help me understand why that would be. If there isn't some way of banding together, why does Iran pose such a threat to these smaller nations?
Well, I would say it's not just Iran, it's any other non-American power that can project into the region, whether that's China or Japan or Britain or France or Turkey. The states of the Arab Gulf are very weak. Most of them only date back to the 70s, and in all cases, they don't want to have a strong military themselves, not because they can't afford it, they certainly can, because they don't think they can trust it. The Arab world writ large has been subject to many, many, many military coups over the last 50 years. These states have avoided that for the most part because they don't have armies. It's a conscious decision. So the U.S. provided their security. They maintain a relatively sedate political system that basically bribes their civilians to not protest, and everybody lives happily ever after. But you remove the Americans from the equation, and all of a sudden you have to solve the defense question. And they can't do that without help.
Is there any way to bring peace between sort of the Persian world and the Arab world? Iran is such it's an unknown factor, and it looked like there was some emerging peace years ago with the deal that Barack Obama signed, but then it kind of fell apart. There's good reasons for it, in my view, and it doesn't sound like they were living up to all the aspects of it. But is there any movement in Iran? Is there any way that with this new alignment occurring that they'll want to be part of it, or is it putting them at odds, going to put them on a collision course?
I wouldn't hold your breath on that. One of the things that kind of defines this whole region is that if you've got a different ethnicity and a different religion, it's going to form a pretty harsh break. And because Iran is up in the highlands, it's basically invasion-proof. So it will always be there, whereas the Arab states will come and go through the ages. The Persians have a continuous civilizational story that stretches back almost 4 millennia, and they've only had 6 regime changes in that time, which is, a really good governing record. Whereas in the Arabs, you could fill an encyclopedia set with the names of the governments that have come and gone over the time since. But as for the short term, no, I don't think so. What the Obama administration was trying to achieve with that deal was, if you're going to leave this region, you have to do one of two things. Number one, you have to anoint a successor to kind of hold the torch and hold things in place when you're gone. Or two, you have to set up a regional balance of power so that no single power can emerge triumphant. Obama chose option 2. Trump prefers option 1. So Obama was thinking, if we give the Iranians a bit of a leg up, then the Arabs in the Iranians will counter each other. Trump's like, no, we want Saudi Arabia to be the superior power in the region. And it's the struggle between those two extremes that kind of defines the American position in the region.
Does that then put the Americans at a continual loggerheads with, say, for instance, Russia? Because Russia seems to be the patron of Iran. I'm not quite sure where China fits into this mix. Maybe you can help me understand that, too. Is it Russia and China aligned with Iran?
The Russians and the Iranians absolutely despise each other. They hate each other far more than they dislike the United States because they actually share a sphere of influence that overlaps and are constantly competing. But if the United States is the dominant power in the Russian near abroad and in the Iranian near abroad, then they have an alliance of convenience against the United States. But if the U.S. just leaves, all of a sudden Iran and Russia are once again at each other's throats. And as an American, I can't wait to watch to see how that turns out.
Okay, now we'll overlay of what China's interests are here. What would you anticipate happening if all of this comes together the way you're seeing?
China kind of feels like the same way towards the Russians and the Iranians. They're allies of convenience and only form a tripartite group when the Americans are around. The problem for the Chinese is if the Americans really do go home, then China is at the end of the world's longest oil supply run. It's 5,000 miles from the Persian Gulf to Shanghai. They do not have the military power to protect those energy shipments. So all of a sudden, everything becomes a panic issue for China because they literally cannot keep the lights on if the Americans are no longer involved. And the Japanese can reach the Persian Gulf, but the Chinese can't. So their biggest regional competitor suddenly controls the gas hose. That absolutely terrifies the Politburo.
Okay. Is Trump just sort of stumbling into this, or is there a bigger strategy here? What do you think?
Best guess, because Trump doesn't really share this sort of details, but best guess is this is about domestic politics in the United States. We have an election coming up, as you, I'm sure, heard the screaming across the border. And the evangelicals are a group that Trump absolutely has to get to show up to the polls, and he has really screwed the pooch on that one. If you remember back during the early stages of the protest, the racial protests in the United States, Trump ordered the park police to use tear gas to clear a square in Washington so he could get a photo op with a Bible in front of the cathedral.
Yep.
That infuriated the evangelical community. And if they don't show up, Trump loses. It's that simple. So he found an issue, Israel, that still manages to electrify the community. And so he sent Kushner over, did a lot of shuttle diplomacy. Trump does deserve some credit for this, and managed to convince two of the Gulf states to make their private relationship with Israel public. That sells. And I've got to admit, this is a big step forward for American diplomacy in the region should we decide to remain involved. Trump does deserve credit for that. But this is not a peace deal. Bahrain and the UAE were never at war with Israel. They've never had troops there. They've never supported groups that were anti-Israel. But this definitely reshapes diplomacy in the region, strategic options in the region, and does give the United States a lot more flexibility regardless of what it decides to do in the future.
Thank you so much for your observations. I sure appreciate your time today.
My pleasure.
That's Peter Zeihan, geopolitical strategist and critically acclaimed author. Okay, that is like the 20,000-foot view. There's still one more segment I have to do, which is, what about the poor Palestinians? What's going to happen to them? Because obviously the strategy has now changed, but what is the outcome likely to be? We'll talk on that on another day. Let's take a pause. Time for calls. 403-974-8255. Stay with us. We'll be back on Chorus Radio. I just feel smarter when I talk to people like that, as do you. So, some of you are saying, wow, that was interesting. I'm going to have to listen to that again. Another one says, whomever that guest is amazing. The beautiful thing is it doesn't appear as though he's biased. Many who comment on U.S. politics, especially in this country, make no attempt at hiding their disdain for the president. And I've got an Edmontonian who says, see, now don't you see how brilliant Trump is? I didn't think there was a single Trump supporter up there. So, guys, look, you don't have to wait, again, for me to interview that guest. Let me tell you who he is, because I have now been introduced to him probably 5 years ago. First heard about him, actually, from Jen Gerson. She wrote about his book in 2014. We had him on, I think now this might be the third time, but he has got his own newsletter that you can sign up to. And it is Zeihan, Zeihan.com. This latest one was waking up to the reality in the Middle East. You can sign up and you can get updates so that you can see what he's thinking about world politics anytime you like. We are out of time for today. Gonna say goodbye to our Edmonton friends and continue on with calls 403-974-8255 right after news. Stay with us on Chorus Radio. Thanks for listening to the Danielle Smith Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review for free on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, or wherever you find your podcasts. And join the conversation. You can reach me on Twitter at abdaniellesmith or by email at danielle@770chqr.com. Talk to you next time.